Welcome to Sociology of Sexualities. I'm Tina Fetner, and this is the optional supplementary material for Module 6, LGBTQ activism. This is a topic I'm very excited about, and I have done some research in this area myself. The first topic in this module is the way that World War II affected lesbian and gay activism. In the United States, we see a lesbian and gay movement, which called itself at the time a homophile movement, began in the post-World War II era in the 1950s. We've already discussed in this class how a related movement started a bit earlier in Germany before the Nazis took power. But when the Nazis took power, they absolutely extinguished the movement, and people were either fled the country or were captured, sent to concentration camps, and many gay men and lesbian women were exterminated in the Holocaust. After World War II, however, we see a real shift in the social organization of places in North America. So this is in the United States as well as in Canada. World War II had a profound impact on the development of young lesbian and gay communities, which already had sort of beginning places started in big cities that were often kind of ports of entry for lots of commerce and trade, right? And so you have big port cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, and Miami. And in Canada, you have similar kind of big sort of centers of trade and industry in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. These big port cities were also the places where lots of active forces that were at the end of the war were coming back home, were sort of relocated to these large cities to, in many cases, find their way back home to their hometown. A lot of times in the United States, the Navy ship would just dump all of its sailors off, or lots of Army and Marines also would get sort of come home in the airports and in the ship ports of these big cities, and they'd sort of have be on their own to get their way back to their hometown. Some people, of course, just stayed in those cities, and it was a moment when large numbers of young, unmarried men and women sort of relocated away from their families into the places that they wanted to live. This is true for men who were serving in the armed forces, but it's also true for women who had those sort of war industry employment opportunities that were previously closed off to women. After the war, we have this moment when people are sort of coming together, and some portion of those, some small perhaps portion of those men and women might have had an inkling that they had attractions to same-sex partners. Some of them decided to stay in those big cities, and this is where gayborhoods began to develop. So we have places where there was already strong arts communities, already sort of a bohemian culture, already kind of fledgling and kind of secretive gay male communities really flourishing post-World War II into large, active neighborhoods where lesbian and gay people could be sort of out of the closet to some degree, right? Even though it wasn't a fully out kind of situation at that time. So that developed over the 1950s and into the 1960s, and as time went on, and especially through the 1960s, which of course saw all kinds of civil rights activism and anti-war activism in regards to the Vietnam War, and a lot of sort of social unrest. The sexual revolution happened, 1969. All of these things influenced people's attitudes, and when it came to lesbian and gay community, they became less and less tolerant of being pushed around, being in the closet, having police, for example, raid their neighborhood bars and dance clubs. And of course, this led to a very famous riot at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Right? But it's very important to know that the Stonewall was not the only place where clashes with the police were happening between lesbian and gay communities, and police departments that were violent against lesbian and gay people, harassing lesbian and gay people, and really made a habit out of making their lives miserable. For example, one of the things that was very common in New York City was for the police to back up a paddy wagon to the door of a bar, load up everyone who was in there because it was a crime to be associated with other homosexuals, fingerprint everyone, process everyone through the social justice system, publish their names and addresses in the newspaper, and then let them go. Drop the charges and let them go. So a real kind of concerted, institutionalized process of harassment of lesbian and gay communities. By 1969, some lesbian and gay communities were fed up with it and were going to fight back. The Stonewall riots was at least the third or fourth riot that had happened. There were riots in Los Angeles, riots in San Francisco, and probably elsewhere that we haven't documented quite as well, that started these kinds of fights against police. But Stonewall was the one that kind of changed everything, right? It got more attention. It was multiple days, right? It didn't last just half an hour or an hour. It went several days, and it became a sort of cause célèbre for the lesbian and gay community. It also is stuck in our memory because the Stonewall riots were the ones that we commemorated, right? And so the pride parades that we celebrate in lesbian and LGBTQ communities every year commemorate the anniversary of this 1969 riot at the Stonewall Inn. So it's often hailed as the birth of the modern lesbian and gay movement that became the LGBTQ movement in the United States, but throughout kind of North America and at least Western Europe as well. I think it's important to pull out the role of drag queens and trans women and people who work the streets. They were the ones that were at the Stonewall Inn. They were had been doing important activism prior to the Stonewall riots. One of the organizations that trans women developed was called STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And these kinds of movement organizations were really important to empower people, and sometimes their stories get lost in the retelling of the Stonewall Inn. It's really important because they sort of were practiced at resisting police harassment. If they were working the streets, they were very familiar with police interventions, very familiar with police harassment, and they were really key to leading the community to resist police harassment. After 1969, when a lot of people were mobilized around the issue of gay rights, which then became lesbian and gay rights, which then became LGBTQ plus rights, we see a rights-based movement emerge in 1969, 1970. Right, so the number of people that were involved in LGBTQ activism increased greatly. It was a small movement, though, however, mostly confined to big cities. The other place where we see these kind of early 1960s and 1970s activism on behalf of lesbian and gay rights was in university towns across the United States and in Canada. One university town in particular was really important, and that is Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where a lot of the activists that developed there were involved in kind of the political activism around, around socialism, around developing healthcare, around kind of anti-capitalist activity, and the expertise that they gained there was very useful for the birth of the lesbian and gay movement in Canada. So these early lesbian and gay rights movements passed a handful of local bills that made it illegal to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation. This wasn't true everywhere. Some places they tried and failed, but in half a dozen or a dozen small towns and cities across the United States, they were successful in anti-discrimination. Of course, activism was also going on in Canada, and the decriminalization of homosexuality occurred in 1969 at the same time as this activism was happening. Some of the activism was cultural, like I have already mentioned the pride parades, but one of the acts of resistance was just holding dances where men would dance with men and women would dance with women. This was a radical act of cultural activism. And then other activism was more policy-oriented, such as putting forward legislation that made it illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation. This early LGBTQ rights-based activism produced a counter-movement. This is one of the things that I particularly have studied, and if you're interested in this topic, you might want to look at my book, How the Religious Right Shaped Lesbian and Gay Activism. It's in the library if you want to check it out. You can see that the lesbian and gay rights-based movement was not very old, just 6 or 7 years old, when a counter-movement emerged. This was in Dade County, which is the city of Miami and the surrounding suburbs. 1976, the local lesbian and gay movement there successfully got that county to pass an anti-discrimination bill. Anita Bryant, who was a kind of national celebrity, and also a member of an evangelical church in the suburbs of Miami, did not like the anti-discrimination bill, and she appealed to the Board of Supervisors, the governing council of Dade County, to reconsider. When they refused to reconsider their decision to make it illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation, Anita Bryant started a social movement. She initially named the movement Save Our Children, right? And you can get a sense of this sort of extremely anti-gay orientation of her social movement. It used a framing that that suggested, well, I say suggested, but it really was quite explicit, that gay rights bills put our children at risk because, in her mind, gay men were out to get children to convert them to a gay lifestyle, and there was a strong suggestion of that there was sexual assault was at risk here. She successfully used the ballot initiative process to repeal the anti-discrimination bill. Ballot initiatives are a legislative process in the United States, not in every area, but in many areas throughout the United States, where instead of the governing body, the Board of Supervisors, deciding on legislation, a ballot initiative allows voters at large to vote directly on legislation. Right? And so in 1977, there were strong attitudes against lesbian and gay people. Homosexuality was considered a serious social problem. And so this kind of widespread antipathy toward lesbian and gay people was expressed by repealing the anti-discrimination bill. Then Anita Bryant took her show on the road and went on tour to help other cities similarly use the ballot initiative process to repeal anti-discrimination bills in several cities across the United States. Anti-LGBTQ activism still exists today. They're still the same organizations, although Anita Bryant herself has retired from this kind of activism. And there's some suggestion she may have had a change of heart, but we don't know for sure. The organizations that were developed in the religious right and elsewhere to fight against LGBTQ equality is still going strong today, especially in the United States, but also in Canada. Lately, they've proposed what they call religious freedom laws, right, which give people the right to discriminate against LGBT people on the basis of religious freedom, right? Like the idea is that Christian faith requires discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Here in Canada, we're also seeing anti-LGBTQ activism. Just this year, in 2019, at the Pride Parade, there was anti-LGBT violence where protesters punched and hit Pride protectors, and has caused a major ongoing battle between right-wing and left-wing forces in Hamilton and elsewhere throughout Canada. So this is an ongoing issue that we might want to think we've left behind, but in fact is still active and perhaps growing today. So that's all I have for you for this week. I'd like you to please do the reading, complete Module 6. Make sure you click all the links and read all of the materials that I've gathered for you to learn everything you need to know, and then you can absolutely destroy the weekly quiz with your impressive intelligence. After you've done Module 6, it's midterm time. So I want you to make sure you put on your to-do list reviewing Modules 1 through 6 for the midterm.